Well, 40 years ago, Newark erupted, followed by Detroit, then city after city across the United States exploded in spontaneous uprisings by disaffected African-American communities who were met with brutal violence by police and National Guardsmen. In Newark, 26 people were killed, and 43 were killed in Detroit. Thousands more were injured. At the height of the Detroit Rebellion on July 28, 1967, President Johnson appointed a National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders to investigate the root causes of the unrest. The final report, known as the Kerner Commission, famously concluded that the United States was, quote, moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal.
Today, on the 40th anniversary of the Newark Rebellion, we go back to the tumultuous days of July 1967. We'll speak with Amiri Baraka and Larry Hamm. Amiri Baraka is a renowned poet, playwright, and activist who is a native of Newark. He was one of the founders of the Black Arts Movement in the 60s and was New Jersey's Poet Laureate in 2002. In 1967, he was arrested and severely beaten by the police during the rebellion. Larry Hamm is a longtime community organizer in Newark and chair of the People's Organization for Progress. It organizes a commemoration of the Newark Rebellion every year. He was 13 years old at the time of the rebellion. We welcome you both to Democracy Now!
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Let's go back to those days. Amiri Baraka, where were you?
You mean when I was arrested?
Well, July 12th it all began. This is July 13th, yeah. Exactly 40 years after. When were you beaten by police? And explain the background of what happened.
Yeah, we were demonstrating in front of the 4th Precinct, where we had a gathering yesterday, and we were demonstrating, and after the demonstration, which Bob Kerwin and Cora led, I walked home down Springfield Avenue from there, and around the corner to my house, which is right next to the Newark Courthouse. And when by the time I got to where I was living and sitting on the porch, kids ran up and said they're breaking out windows around the corner. I jumped in my car with 2 other friends of mine, and we drove right around the corner. And by the time we got up to, Belmont Avenue, it was on. People were breaking out windows. There were already fires, and the police, you could see the police circling. So we were driving through, in and out, zigzagging through these streets, looking, seeing what was happening.
How did it all erupt? How did it all begin before July 12th?
Well, see, if you want to talk about that, I said yesterday, you have to start with slavery, because those abuses have never been eradicated. People are not living in slums because they voted to. Their children not in jail because they wanted them to. These are the results of a people who've been oppressed and suffer national oppression. And so in a city like Newark, which is the 3rd oldest city in the United States, by the way, where all these kind of abuses sort of converge, and the racism on top of that, I mean, one absurd example is one time I was directing a play, and the police rushed into the loft, and the man actually took the script out of my hand, as if it was some kind of a volatile weapon, So that day we had been picketing because they had beaten up a black cab driver, a guy named John Smith. But that whole month, the 2 months before that, there was contentions. First, they wanted 160 acres for a medical school. We found out the biggest medical school in the United States was Johns Hopkins, which is like 1.5 acres. They wouldn't hire this guy as, what was his name, Wilbur Parker, as the secretary of the Board of Education. Guy, what was it, a Cornell master's degree. They hired instead this one of Adnesio's cronies who had high school graduate. They had run into this Muslim dojo, a karate school, and beaten up everybody there. And then the John Smith, and so they pulled him out of the car, beat him up, circulated that he had dead. And so people gathered at that precinct, and then that was very explosive that night. That was the night before. That was, say, the 11th. So the next day we were picketing that precinct because that's where it happened. And that was the day by the time the sun started going down, that's when it broke out.
Now, we saw a clip of Mayor Adonisio, but could you talk a little bit about the political climate, the mayor's regime, as well as Anthony Imperiale was running around then in those days, and what was the climate that the majority population, the black community in Newark, was feeling then?
See, first of all, when you say Adonisio, who was indicted and, what was it? He was given 1% of the city's budget to the mob.
He was the mayor.
He was the mayor, Adonisio, No Neck Adonisio. And his Spina, was it was interesting that Spina, who was the police chief, when they beat me up, they didn't take me to prison or they took me to Spina's office, and threw me on the floor. And he says, just like I'm right out of the movies, they got you, and I said, but I ain't dead.
He was head of police.
Yeah, he was the police chief,
And they brought you to his
office, not to jail. Mm-hmm. But since I had given my given name, Everett L. Jones, laborer, then they could deny until my wife got hold of Allen Ginsberg, and he got hold of Jean-Paul Sartre, and Sartre called the police station.
From France?
Yeah, called the police station. Sartre and Ginsberg and those people started, And then the only reason I got my life saved is the people in the apartment building where they were beating me start throwing things out of the window at them. Otherwise, I would be gone, But it was a very, very, the racism that existed
By then you were already a very well-known poet and published author.
And harassing them, in that town. See, the town's too small for you to be doing something. I mean, they actually have policemen stop a poetry reading. I mean, that's how wild it was getting. They would ride up and down the street and make remarks at my wife and the other ladies in that block, calling them all kinds of slurs. I mean, this was a daily, a nightly thing. And so it became like, back and forth, And finally, it just erupted. We were trying to do things. We were putting out literature suggesting that we could have a mayor. Mm-hmm. We could have a city council. That Stokely had come out with Black Power, and I was spray paint Black Power in all these buildings in the city, So they knew who it was. And once I got arrested, they ran in my house to destroy all of the leaflets and stuff that we were, but my wife was smart enough to get that stuff out of there and move it to somebody else's house down the street. But they destroyed our mimeograph machines and stuff like that. They destroyed my car, I mean, it was, search and destroy mission because they knew who it was, in that little context. But the whole city, as Harper's Magazine said, the worst city in the United States was Newark. 18,000 people density in 1 square mile, talking about the project. So it was a city that was always on the verge,
We're talking to Amiri Baraka. When we come back, we'll also talk to Larry Hamm, well-known community organizer, who was 13 at the time of the rebellion. After the Newark rebellion died down, Detroit erupted. We'll go to Detroit to speak with Grace Lee Boggs. But we'll also hear from family members in Newark of those who lost loved ones. Ultimately, 26 people died in the rebellion of Newark. Our guests in studio in New York are Amiri Baraka, poet, playwright, activist, beaten almost unconscious, then taken to the office of the police commissioner in Newark by the Newark police in the midst of the uprising, one of the founders of the Black Arts movements in the 60s. He was New Jersey's poet laureate as well. Larry Hamm is with us, community organizer in Newark, chair of the People's Organization for Progress that year after year has organized a commemoration of the Newark Rebellion. We went out to the commemoration yesterday. Larry Hamm, you were 13 when the uprising took place.
Yes. Believe it or not, I was at a party across the street from my house that evening. Some folks ran upstairs and said Springfield Avenue was on fire. And we all ran out the house, ran down the stairs. We were getting ready to run down 12th Street. We were running down 12th Street. But my mother, we lived across the street. She was on the porch. She said, "You're not going down the Springfield Avenue." And she probably saved my life by doing so. But it was a cataclysmic event. I'll never forget. I mean, I think it was the event that shaped my life. I came from a regular kind of working class family. My father's a truck driver. He passed away. We went to live with my grandparents. My grandfather was a boiler man. My mother was a seamstress. We didn't talk about politics too much, but after the rebellion broke out, that all changed. It was like our political awakening, or my political awakening. Our community was under military occupation. We could stand out on our second floor porch and look out and see everything that was going on. Sometimes it was festive with the looting, but then sometimes it was outright violent, and people were stoning cars that were trying to move into the white community and so forth. And then the Guard came in, and then we were literally under military occupation. They had like set up posts on either end of our street. I lived a block and a half from Springfield Avenue. For 3 days, we were under, more than 3 days, I think we were under martial law. We couldn't leave our house. And then when it was lifted and we had to go out and get food, because people couldn't get food. The stores were looted. You didn't have no food. They would search our cars going in and search our cars going out. The Guard would go door to door looking for contraband. And it's funny because I remarked to you yesterday, I can relate to probably what the people in Gaza are going through and in other countries are going through, because we know what military occupation is all about. But that rebellion changed, I think, changed the course of history of the city and probably impacted the nation. 2 weeks after the rebellion, even though I was a young person, I know this now, I didn't know it then, but 2 weeks after the rebellion, Black Power Conference was held. A year later, the Black Political Convention was held at West Kenny Junior High School. We were just a block away from that in Newark, right? So West Kenny Junior High School in Newark. And a year after that, 1969, was the Black and Puerto Rican Political Convention. And the Community's Choice team came out of that, and Ken Gibson was on that team, Sharp James,
the next mayor.
Yes, Dennis Westbrooks. Gibson became mayor in 1970, and in 1971, he appointed me to the Newark Board of Education, and I became the youngest voting school board member in the history of the country.
You were a high school student.
I was 17 years old, just like 4 years after the rebellion. I had just graduated from high school. I wasn't even old enough to vote. But see, the rebellion stirred up everything. There were all kind of movements in Newark. And there was a student movement, and there was a teacher strike. And the teacher strike was the longest teacher strike in the history of the country. We thought we weren't going to graduate, so all the high school students, we got together, we formed an organization, we marched on the board and the teachers union. They were negotiating at the Gateway Hotel in 1971, and 200 of us took over 2 floors of the Gateway Hotel and had a sit-in. We said we weren't leaving until the mayor came. That's when I met Ken Gibson. And it was just a couple of months after that, he appointed me to the Newark Board of Education.
So, in essence, what you're saying is that the rebellion itself sparked the political political awakening in Newark. And Newark, in effect, wasn't Gibson the first black mayor of a major American city?
He was of a major East Coast city.
Yeah, major East Coast city, right.
Yes. And, you know, Newark was already in transition. I mean, I believe there was a Black Power Conference held in 1966. Gibson ran for mayor in 66 and lost in 66. But see, the rebellion was a thing, I think, that helped transform a lot of people's consciousness.
And yesterday was the first time a mayor, Cory Booker of Newark, walked in your commemoration march, where you marched from the 4th precinct, from the police precinct, to the marker.
Well, he didn't go to the marker now. He dropped out. When we turned that corner away from the precinct, he disappeared into the mist.
Talk about that marker, Larry Ham.
Well, everybody in Newark that was there in 67 knew that it was the seminal event that you can't understand Newark today without knowing something about 1967, and everybody felt that there should be something that would be a constant reminder of what happened. And so people asked for some kind of monument to those who perished during the rebellion. And the city council, primarily, I guess George Branch was the Central Ward councilman then, you know, facilitated the establishment of that monument, and it has the names of all 26 people on it.
Yesterday at the march, some of the family members of those who died were there. Yes. Crystal Spellman's mother, Eloise, was killed by gunfire from police, state troopers, National Guardsmen 40 years ago. A mother of 11, Eloise, was shot through the neck while closing the windows of her apartment in the Hayes Home Public Housing Project on July 15, 1967. This is an excerpt from a documentary made over 2 years ago. It's called Newark, more than 2 decades ago. It's called Newark, The Slow Road Back. It's produced by Sandra King. It aired last night on New Jersey Network on PBS. It includes Crystal Spellman describing her relief at seeing her old project building destroyed as she recalls what happened to her mother.
When they blew up the projects, or some of them, I felt good and relieved that these buildings won't be there anymore, so I wouldn't have to watch them every time I drove down the street or drove down Springfield Avenue. I wouldn't have to watch these buildings and remember what happened, you know, to my family. My mother had 11 children. We all lived in the project. My mother was killed in the 1967 riots. She was shot twice. From what I understand, she was closing the window, and they shot her. They thought that she was a sniper, and they shot her. The way the sofa was set up in the living room, you know, the sofa was by the window, and of course she fell back on the sofa, you know.
You saw that?
Yeah, I saw that. I can remember that. I remember all the blood. I remember you can take the pillow and the couch and just do like this to it, and the blood would all come out. I remember that.
That was Crystal Spellman from the New Jersey Network Sandra King documentary. There was also someone else who talked yesterday. His name was Ernest Rutledge, and he was talking about his brother, James Rutledge. James Rutledge is someone a lot of people refer to. James Rutledge, the man who was shot 39 times. How did that happen, Amiri Baraka? And how significant was that moment?
Well, they claimed that James Rutledge was looting this bar, Joe Ray's Tavern on Bergen Street. You know, his relatives obviously, you know, said another thing happened. He was in the store hiding, you know, and then he came out because the stuff had been done. You know, the place had been looted already. He told a couple of his companions to hide, and then he stood up, and they asked him, was anybody else there? And he said no, then they shot him. But what was the most brutal thing is that he had 4 shots in the top of his head. I got hold of these autopsy pictures from a law student, you know, Junius Williams, and I proceeded to distribute the pictures all over the city. You know, we made copies of them, and they tried to indict me. Not the people who shot this boy, but they wanted to indict me for distributing the flicks. But if you saw those flicks, they are so horrific. You know what I mean? You see anybody shot in the top of their head, they're not even shot running. You know, they wasn't running. You know what I mean? They had actually, he was down and they put the gun to his head and blew holes in the top of his skull.
So let's go for a minute to Ernest Rutledge, remembering that moment. He was speaking to us yesterday in Newark, right next to the tombstone that honors the 26 people who died in Newark.
He was killed in the riots of 67, or the rebellion, they say 67, but it was, he was in a tavern on Bergen Street, Bergen and Custer, and the state troopers told everybody just to get off the streets, and so everybody was running for cover because they were shooting like crazy, and him and 2 of the boys that we grew up with, their name was Hatcher. They ran into this tavern that had already been looted and everything. And in fact, I, as a plumber, I own a plumbing business, I got a chance to work in that tavern. And as I put the boiler in, I put a very large boiler in the basement and installed it. I looked up at the ceiling, the ceiling of the basement with the floor of the tavern, in the back part of it, where my brother was killed. And when I got through, I went upstairs and I looked around, where he looked at and where the boys told me that they hid and stayed down behind that bar. My brother told him when the state troopers came in, they asked him, who came in here with you? And he said, no one. And my brother told him, don't say nothing. And at that time, the state troopers, they started shooting him, and they reloaded their guns 3 times, and they kept shooting. That's how many holes my brother had so many holes in his body. Until at his funeral, you could see the circles, the rings and everything, with the bullets all in his neck, all back here, everywhere. And Mr. Perry, Orlando, he told us to get back because, and they put a barrier off, so he said because his body could collapse at any time. And my mother said to Mr. Perry, and she was on my arm, I'll never forget that. She said, Mr. Perry, how many holes did my son have in him? He said, Miss Rutledge, at 39, we stopped counting. That's how many holes my brother's body had in him. And then I saw a picture of my brother on a slab with so many holes all of his body. This incident, my mother she had a nervous breakdown, she became paranoid, and then above all, she became schizophrenic, and she had to be institutionalized behind this incident. And then I had to spread my wings to raise my other 12 siblings. So.
And the top of his head?
In the top of his head and all over his body. His face. What we saw, they had the makeup, couldn't cover up the holes. You could see a little dark rings and everything. It was that bad.
How old were you?
I was 17 and my brother was 19.
Ernest Rutledge remembering his brother James. There were no indictments. Juan?
Amiri, the ferocity of the way the National Guard and state troopers and the police attempted to put down the rebellion. Could you talk a little bit about the white-black relations in the city? And I mentioned before Anthony Imperiale, who, for people who are younger, who was Imperiale and what did he represent in terms of race relations in the Northeast?
Imperiale was just a kind of a hoodlum who seized on that time to become the mouth of racist reaction. That's what he was. And he issued this statement with himself holding this rifle. If the Black Panther comes, the white hunter is waiting, you know. But we took that photograph.
He was a councilman at the time?
He got to be a councilman later as a result of that, you see. Even later, he became a state official. But we took this photograph of him holding this rifle with his stomach. He had this huge stomach sticking out. And when we ran Gibson for mayor, we distributed these photos of him holding the rifle and said, would you want this for a mayor? But Imperiale was, he was a pawn. You know, he was a mouthpiece. Actually, when we tried to build this Coweta Towers, Imperiale was making noise, so we bribed him. You know, he said, look, what do you want, Tony? We'll give you jobs, blah, 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 just shut up. And he was cooled out, but it was this Stephen Adebayo who emerged as the power broker. It was Steve Adebayo who was behind, actually, the opposition, the behind-the-scene opposition to Coweta Towers, so that we spent $1 million to make a hole for the building, and then we spent $2 million to cover the hole. So it was a $3 million nothing, you know. But that kind of rabid reaction, first of all, a lot of the white folks were moving, you know, out of there. That's why the North Ward, which was once a solid Italian community, is now a solid Latino community. As a matter of fact, and then they started to actually set fire to the Latinos' homes then. And that's when, you know, Felipe Luciano, Ramon Rivera, and I made this mutual defense pact. We called the press conference and say, you know, any violence against the Afro-American community is, you know, violence against the Puerto Rican community. Any violence against the Puerto Rican community is violence against the Afro-American community. So Imperiale sends a telegram to the governor and asks, is that legal? I mean, that's kind of mental, the kind of mental midget he was, you know what I'm saying? But you see, that was the kind of energy, because we thought we were fighting directly against oppression. That was a war. And what Larry says, Adimu, right? I named him, but what that meant is that this war had finally materialized wholly. We had been fighting it verbally, but when they started shooting, and it was, you say, the rebellion, the people had stopped breaking in store windows and stuff after the first couple of days. But that's when the murders started. You see, when you put that under martial law, You see, my wife, you know, of course I was locked up, but she went back to the house, and we had just been married about a year, right? And the little baby we had, Obalaji, she took him up to the 3rd floor and got in the closet and closed the door. She had a pot of lye with some, she had a pot of hot water lye and some Alaga syrup there, a little napalm. And she was sitting in there with the child in there because they were running up and down, you know, like trying to destroy our house, you know.
You talked about Ademo, who you named Larry Hamm. Your name, Amiri Baraka. You were born Everett Jones, became Leroy Jones, then Amiri Baraka. Why?
I was Everett Leroy Jones. My grandfather's name was Everett. He was a politician in that town. My family came to Newark in the 20s. We've been there a long, long time. My father's name was Leroy, you know. The Frenchified aspect of it, because his first name was Coyette. You see, they come from South Carolina. You see, I changed my name when we became aware of the African Revolution and the whole question of our African roots. I was named by the man who buried Malcolm X, Hisham Jabber, who died last week. He named me Amiri Baraka, but that's Arabic. I brought it down into Swahili land, into Tanzania, which is an accent. So it's Amiri instead of Amir, and, you know, Baraka rather than Barakat, you know, which is interesting. If it was Amir Barakat, I'd probably have more difficulty flying these days.
We're going to, yes, Ryan?
And it was after the Black Political Convention in Gary, Indiana in 1972, which was like another seminal event coming out of the period of the rebellions. I was one of the youngest delegates to Gary in 1972. It was after Gary that I asked Amiri Baraka to give me an African name, because that was another transforming event for me, to see black people coming together in a great act of self-determination.
And you also led the anti-apartheid movement at Princeton University, yes. But that's another story for another show. We're talking to Amiri Baraka and Larry Hamm. When we come back from break, we will also be joined by Grace Lee Boggs. As Newark quieted down, Detroit erupted. So we're going to Detroit. Stay with us.